two things that come to mind that the pandemic really demonstrated. Number one, and heightened. Number one, the desire to have visibility into the condition and performance of operating assets. And number two, the recognition that any asset can become a remote asset if suddenly people aren't allowed to go to their normal place of work where they normally have direct access to these assets. So when we think about cryogenic liquid tanks, for example, the needs for telemetry and monitoring really were heightened because of the sudden, rapid, and massive changes in longstanding order patterns. For example, with COVID, we saw in many cases demand for medical oxygen, it suddenly quadrupled almost overnight in response to a regional COVID surge. At restaurants, the demand for CO2 just suddenly dropped to nothing in many cases, almost literally overnight because restaurants were shut down. And then they restarted without really any predictable schedule. So we had, in both cases, we had companies who were supplying liquids, liquid oxygen or liquid CO2 to assets that they had no visibility into. They had longstanding order patterns, so they thought they knew when they needed to make deliveries, and suddenly that all got thrown out the window. And the number of runouts just shot up through the roof. The number of inefficient deliveries, people showing up at tanks that were already full, that shot up through the roof. The inefficiencies increased exponentially. So that drove recognition and a lot of interest in remote telemetry and monitoring. And then beyond that, people are, I think, taking a broader view of things. They're looking up and down the supply chain. So there's a lot of interest in not just tanks themselves, but the assets that produce the gases that ultimately get delivered to the tanks, the assets that carry them to the tanks, tube trailers, liquid trailers, helium ISOs, other ISOs, and then downstream and adjacent to the tanks. There's a lot of equipment that is also involved in delivering gases through into the pipes and application equipment. So we're seeing just a lot of interest up and down the supply chain. And I think, Thierry sort of mentioned this as well. There are certain things that are happening in society that were going to happen, and they have been accelerated by some of the changes that we've lived through over the past year and a half or 2 years.